You're listening to Switched On Australia, the podcast that tracks the opportunities and challenges of electrifying everything, everywhere. Switched On is brought to you by the publishers of Renew Economy, Australia's best informed, most read website focusing on the green energy transition, and is supported by Boundless Earth. Boundless Earth uses philanthropy, investment and direct advocacy to help Australia become a global force in a decarbonised world. Hello, and thanks for joining me on the Switched On Australia podcast. I'm Anne Delaney. Australia's renewable energy transition is definitely gathering pace, but so too is the divide between those who support it and those who don't. I've been listening in this week on some of the hearings at the Senate inquiry on misinformation and disinformation on climate and energy, and it really does make for sober listening. It was clear that beneath our rush to build the transmission lines, the wind farms and solar projects, lies a much bigger challenge, and that is building trust. Because, as we know, the energy transition isn't just about infrastructure, it's about people. And that's something Professor Sara Bice has spent years studying. Her research explores how governments, industry and communities can collaborate to deliver major projects that are fair, transparent and socially sustainable. A specialist in social licence and public participation, she's advised state and federal agencies and energy companies on how to strengthen trust in the transition. Her research shows that the number one driver of public acceptance for new infrastructure isn't technology or even local benefits. It's confidence in the regulation that governs it. Professor Bice is based at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University, where she directs the Institute for Infrastructure in Society. And I began by asking her whether Australia's current approach to community engagement is helping the energy transition or holding it back.
I think that the current approach to the energy transition is rapidly learning lessons from community engagement in the very recent past, which has been holding us back and which has been posing threats to our ability to enact Australia's energy transition within the urgent timeframe required. So as recently as 2024, and many of your listeners will be aware of this report and of these statistics, but the former Australian Energy Infrastructure Commissioner's report on community engagement across the sector, so this was as recent as November 2024, found that 92% of Australians surveyed reported being dissatisfied with the engagement that they had experienced directly in relation to the energy transition. So we had, the vast majority of survey respondents, and we do have to take that with a little grain of salt because that is a sample. It's not everyone. And sometimes the individuals who are least happy about something are also the ones most likely to respond to a survey. That being said, this was a very robust study. The results are trustworthy. And to have 92% of Australians in, less than 12 months ago reporting being dissatisfied with their experiences of engagement in the transition, that's a big red flag. Now, to your question, how are we going now? I think that big red flag has been quite important because over the past 12 months, we have seen a genuine, I believe, refocusing of attention on the importance of community engagement and what I call the social transition. And that social transition is about what are the non-technical things that we need to get right in order to have an energy transition? What is the policy that we need that will support communities? What practices need to be happening on the ground to address community and societal concerns and constraints, and also to tell people about the opportunities that are going to affect the speed and quality and success of our energy transition? So I think we're doing better.
But we've still got some way to go.
Look, we've certainly started from a low bar.
Yes. And do you think that that change that has been happening in the last 12 months, has that been because the renewable energy industry has woken up to the fact that they probably weren't doing it very well in the past, or government has woken up, or communities have just got much better organised?
Well, I think, and you've set out the trifecta there. The private sector has seen some surveys and some, direct engagements that haven't gone well, and they're very interested in efficiency and creating monetary value for their companies. So they want to get their infrastructure in place and they want to see their renewables projects up and running. So from the private sector, there's been their own motivating factors. For the Australian government, the government is consistently looking at how do we have a swift, hopefully fair and just energy transition. And certainly they're recognizing that there is more to be done to shape the way that the private sector engages with communities. Now, that is especially important in our energy transition. Australia, like most other countries around the world, is heavily reliant on the private sector to deliver the renewables infrastructure that we need for the transition. So, around about 95% of renewables projects in Australia, and that figure is very similar internationally, that large percentage of projects are the responsibility or being driven by the private sector. Now, this is quite different to other major infrastructure in Australia, where for the vast majority of that infrastructure, the government is the key client or proponent, and they're then subcontracting often to private sector, but the government holds the key. So our regulators and our policymakers are really having to think about new ways to shape relationships with the private sector in relation to major infrastructure in ways that they haven't in the past. And you can see that reflected as an example. We have this entity called the Australian Energy Market Operator, and that's known as AEMO. And as recently as last October, AEMO put out something called its Capacity Investment Scheme. So this is their big initiative to ensure that we have enough infrastructure and enough investment in our energy sector to affect the transition. And as part of that, they have put within their tendering criteria. So AEMO will put out to market and say, we need these things. Come and tell us if you're going to be the best organization to deliver those things. And within the criteria that they are now using to judge which subcontractors do they want to bring on, they have introduced a social license criteria. So they are starting to formally assess how these companies are attending to components of the social transition.
One thing, though, that I wonder about, because there were so many missteps, I went to the Farmers for Climate Action Conference a few weeks ago, and it was really clear that some of the farmers there, who are very pro renewables, and they're right on the front line of climate change there, they were still very critical of the way that the renewable energy industry treats them, and they've been burnt in the past. And it feels like there's a long way to go here. So we may get protocols, we may have an emo saying that, we've got to look at social license, but it's how we do that that is the crucial question, isn't it?
Yeah, I completely agree. And there's looking at social license, which very simply is the level of acceptance of a project or a policy within a defined community. There's looking at it, and then there's actually doing it. And to achieve social license, we know from decades of research that you must have something called procedural fairness. And in Australia, we love fairness and we love equity. Procedural fairness means that the processes, the steps that you've taken to reach a decision have been perceived as fair. So even if at the end of the day, people disagree with the ultimate decision, if you said to them, yeah, but but how was the process? Were you respected? Was it open? Was it transparent? Was it accessible to you and your community? Do you feel like you had a fair go? People would say yes. I may not agree with the result, but we did have a fair, robust process. So right now, I think there is a huge lack of procedural fairness, and I do think that efforts are being made to improve that, but we're not there yet. When we look, you talked about Farmers for Climate Action, the Australian farming community in particular, and Australians living in rural and regional areas, they are being asked to shoulder the burden of Australia's renewable energy infrastructure on behalf of us all. So we are making a huge ask of individuals who already give us a lot. And as you rightly noted, individuals who on the day to day are experiencing the direct impacts of climate change, more frequent severe weather events, flooding, bushfires, drought. These are the things that affect farmers' daily lives. They affect their capacity to earn money for their families. So there is also this really important nuance to this discussion where when rural and regional Australian communities say we are pushing back against the energy transition, it is not necessarily and most often not about them saying we don't believe in climate change or we don't think that the renewable transition is necessary. What they are saying is the way that this transition is being done, and often it feels as though it's being done to them, not with them. That is the problem, and that's where we need to see some changes.
Yes, and a number of these farmers that I spoke to, they talked about not being seen as partners,
Mm.
and at that point that you made, that this is something that is done to them. Changing that whole relationship between the industry and the people who were really, as you said, gonna shoulder the burden of this. Changing that relationship really, doesn't it take not just the right process, as you said, procedural fairness, but also doesn't it take the right people to actually be doing that engagement?
Yeah, it does, and look, a lot of times I do think we have very good people on the ground in terms of engagement because, as is often the case with infrastructure projects of all types in Australia, the community engagement itself is very often outsourced or subcontracted to consultants who do community engagement for big projects all the time. What I think is hobbling us is a step before the engagement, and that is the perceptions that are shaping approaches to the transition more generally. And so there is this presumed benevolence.
Yes, and I've read this
Yeah.
in what you've written, and I'm very intrigued by this concept.
Yeah. So hopefully it's a helpful word for people who are experiencing these things on the ground. We often talk about unconscious biases. So most of us will know what those are. These are these ideas that we carry around with us, and we're often not aware of them, and they come to us because of our personal experiences and our beliefs, and they shape how we see things in the world and how we understand things in the world. And when it comes to the renewable energy transition, it is suffering, I believe, from many policymakers, so those in government who are in charge of thinking about how the government does the energy transition, the scientists who are really concerned about the urgency of climate adaptation, and the private sector developers involved in our energy transition who, on the one hand, see it a great opportunity to make money, but also many of them are motivated to do something good. And these individuals who are responsible largely for pursuing the energy transition, they bring this unconscious bias of presumed benevolence. The transition is necessary, it is a good thing, and we have to do it all together. And so, therefore, everyone's going to support it. And what's happening is that, and this is happening all over the world, it's not just in Australia. Our team has researched case studies from places as far flung as Venezuela through to Kenya. This is happening everywhere where governments, developers are going in and they are surprised when community members push back and say, wait a minute, this isn't how we want to go about the transition. So that presumed benevolence is leading to situations like regulation that streamlines renewable energy infrastructure. So the regulatory requirements around renewable energy infrastructure are, and many Australians will understand this juxtaposition, they're quite different to what we require, for instance, for a major mining project. Now, these transitions, these infrastructures can be of a similar scale. And for local community members, they can be of a similar disruption. But because the renewable infrastructure is perceived as good and, bringing something that we require, and the mining infrastructure is perceived as degrading or damaging, it has a lot more structures and restrictions around it than the renewable infrastructure. So this presumed benevolence lens is shaping both how communities are being approached on ground in terms of engagement, and it's also shaping the regulation that guides the implementation. And that's quite important because in our research, we look at what are the main drivers or what are the main predictors of a social license for a big infrastructure project. And in Australia, nationally, the number one driver of public trust in an infrastructure development is the level of confidence in the regulation that's guiding that development.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. So if we are in a situation where the government takes this presumed benevolence perspective on renewables, and that then leads to more streamlined or perhaps less robust regulatory, environmental, and social impact assessment requirements than, say, we would see on other types of projects. And then community members are seeing this infrastructure come in. They're feeling, in some instances, steamrolled or overrun. This has a flow on effect to levels of acceptance. We see it in the research, and you can see it playing out anecdotally, especially in our renewable energy zones.
Those regulations, though, they have to be at so many different levels for communities to feel confident and to feel that there has been that procedural fairness. And you mentioned that, scientists, climate-friendly politicians and renewable energy operators are surprised or baffled by public resistance or even outright rejection of renewables projects. But I'm wondering, are they baffled by the public resistance or the weaponizing of anti-renewable sentiment and resistance?
Yeah, look, I think they are. I mean, I think, again, if you come to this with the perspective that what we are doing here is a good thing and it's necessary and everybody wants it, I think that there is both a bafflement, as you say, and also a frustration. Oh, well, how come these people can't understand how important this is? And I think that there is a big piece of work to be done for those who are responsible for instituting the energy transition, whether it's the infrastructure or the markets. We haven't talked about energy affordability, but that's another issue that faces different parts of the community. Whatever component of the energy transition we're talking about, community members across Australia are saying, I think, two things, and I don't mean to generalize here because we're a very diverse nation. But the first is that most are saying, look, we agree that we need to have a renewables transition. We need to have climate adaptation. And they're also saying, but this needs to occur in a fair and just way. And so I do think we have a lot of work to do. The challenge for us is that I work in a school of public policy, and one of my jobs is to train public servants to be able to design and deliver policy. That takes a long time. Policy, I mean, it's called a bureaucracy for a reason, right? So
Yeah.
policy and regulation, it's incredibly slow. We know that across the board, regulation lags need and regulation lags reality, I think is fair to say. So we're in a real bind here in that we have, an urgent issue in climate change it's not slowing down. It's not going away. We have, unfortunately, incredibly slow structures and institutions that need to respond to this urgent issue. And at least in Australia, and again, this is reflected internationally simply because of the types of location where most current renewable energy technology needs to be based. Across the globe, renewable energy infrastructure is going primarily on rural and regional landscapes. Across the globe, it has a greater impact on indigenous lands, so lands held by First Nations people as opposed to the rest of the population. And that can also mean that the infrastructure is going in places where people are facing lower socioeconomic situations. So there is a real equity gap across the transition. So we've got all these things happening. We've got climate change, it's not going away, it's really urgent. We've got, the unfortunate reality of government bureaucracy, which needs to respond quickly to this issue, but which is very slow and on which public trust depends. And then we've got a number of communities who disproportionately need to support the energy transition by dint of our technologies and where they need to be located. So it's definitely a complex situation.
It's incredibly complex. And in addition to all the barriers or the hindrances that you've just identified, we've also got misinformation. I've been reading some of the submissions to the Senate Committee inquiry into climate change and energy misinformation and disinformation. There's an incredible amount of misinformation being driven by a whole range of sources. We've got, climate contrarian think tanks. We've got AI-driven bots, astroturfing campaigns. We've got fossil fuel industry undermining, legitimate renewable energy campaigns. To what extent are those barriers impacting productive conversations about the real challenges and the real opportunities of the energy transition?
Yeah, so you've nailed one of the major challenges that we face. This challenge is so prevalent that just this year, so in March of this year, our institute, in partnership with the Municipal Association of Victoria, we have launched a 3-year research fellowship into disinformation response. So, for you listeners, if you go online and you look up the Disinformation Response Playbook, that is now readily, freely available. And it gives advice, particularly at the local council level, for how to identify mis and disinformation that might be happening in your local area. And more importantly, very practical steps for what you can do about that. So, we recognize this as a major issue. Let's take a step even before we get to disinformation, which is malicious information, right? So this is information that's being put out purposely to cause harm.
To slow down, to harm,
Exactly.
to divert.
All of those things. So disinformation is malicious and it has a malicious intent and a purpose. Misinformation is much more naive. So misinformation can be just as impactful, but it doesn't have that malignant intent. It's just bad information. And so if we move a step before both of those things, what's happening right now that we are struggling with is the rapid change in the way that our society accesses information. So we can blame the internet and social media for a lot of things. But one of the challenges that it poses is there used to be a few shared, collective, reliable, maybe not always balanced, but certainly reliable sources of information. And the majority of our population would get their information from those sources. Now, they might have had different political bents. You're here in Melbourne, you could read the Herald Sun versus The Age, but you were still getting a reliable shared source of information.
And that information was better regulated. So it comes back to that
Exactly.
point that you were making before. The driver of trust is having a trust in regulation, that it's going to be there to be the safety net.
Exactly. And so now today, not only do we lack that kind of collective shared source of information, even if we had political leanings that were different in terms of which source we chose, there were just a few that we could all choose from. So we were more on the same page. Today, and this does color community engagement. Because when a community engagement officer is going out to meet with someone, they have no idea what this person has been reading or engaging with. Have they been on a Reddit channel that has been telling them that the solar battery that's going to be located near their farm is going to cause cancer? Have they been seeing information about wind turbines, which suggests all types of things that simply aren't true, but which to them are being reinforced through these online echo chambers where they're getting their information? And that doesn't mean that these people are unintelligent. It doesn't mean that these people, it's not their fault. It's just we live in this world now where information comes from so many different sources that we lack a shared source of truth or information, as it were. And this has all kinds of flow on effects for how people think about the transition, what their concerns are. It's creating an entirely new area of community engagement where officers are having just to deal with disinformation and misinformation in the first place before they can even engage on their actual project. And it is really, really challenging, but we're starting now to develop some ways to both identify mis and disinformation more readily. And again, the disinformation response playbook is one good thing to look at to get some advice on that. And then there are ways that we can respond to this, but it is going to be a big challenge.
And would you suggest better regulation, changing legislation, for instance, tightening up rules for the tech bros?
Look, I mean, obviously, and like that would be ideal, but as I've already said in this podcast, that takes forever. So one of the challenges that we face is the proliferation of various information sources has occurred far more rapidly than what the government could predict or respond to or regulate. So in the first instance, my advice would be not to look towards regulation as the answer, but to look towards more collective action. So in our disinformation response playbook, one of the things that we strongly recommend is to form collaborative groups, particularly amongst local councils or within, say, your renewable energy zone, where those organizations are working at the local level to understand what mis or disinformation is most prevalent in our local area and how can we start to dispel that more directly. So yes, we need more regulation, but the regulation is going to take time. It's unclear as to whether it will be effective. So if we look even at the ongoing discussion about limiting young people's access to social media, even that is not looking particularly realistic, as well-intentioned as it may be. So I think what we need to do is look towards more effective action through collective action and collaboration at the local level in the first instance.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of comes down to, yet again, what we've been talking about, social community engagement. It needs government support, it needs regulation, but it's very much on the ground, local communities, local trust being built. It's quite organic in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think it is, and I think that's where, when we think about policy making, this is where we have to have the intersection between the lived experience of people on the ground, and I appreciate that can sound a bit like a weasel word, but really understanding a place-based approach to our renewable energy transition. We need to understand what are the values and priorities of the local communities who are being asked to host renewable energy infrastructure? What are their fears and concerns? And some of those may be based in mis or disinformation, but we need to, in the first instance, understand what they are and what is their long-term vision for their community. So if we look, for instance, around this time last year, I was very privileged to be on a panel with IAP2 and Helen Haynes, who's the independent MP from Indi here in Victoria. And many of your listeners will probably know Dr. Haynes and her work. She was speaking about the concerns of her constituents about the proposed solar farm and large-scale battery in her area. And again, this doesn't mean that individuals in that electorate don't support renewable energy or don't believe that climate change is real, but they have very particular concerns. This is a community that was catastrophically affected by bushfires in recent times. And although the risk of solar battery fire is incredibly low, if you ask the engineers, they'll say, look, incredibly unlikely. But we also know that if there is a battery fire, they're very hard to put out. So for communities who are facing the introduction of this type of infrastructure into an area where they have been personally and in some instances catastrophically affected by bushfire, the risk to them, it might be disproportionate to what the engineers say is, the likely percentage of this occurring, but the risk to them is unacceptable. People in that area have said things like, we moved to the bush because we want the quiet. And now we're very concerned, is this battery going to make a hum? So it doesn't mean that these are insurmountable issues. What it means is that we really need to understand from a place-based perspective, what do people care about? What are their priorities? What are their concerns? Our research at the Institute demonstrates incontrovertibly that perceived risks about a renewable energy project are just as impactful for project acceptance as manifest, as actual risks. So where communities perceive a particular risk, even if that risk is based in misinformation, even if that risk, according to the engineers, is incredibly unlikely to occur, like in the case of a solar battery fire, even if that risk, the scientists would say is not real, the perception alone is powerful enough to impact or reduce levels of project acceptance in a community.
And it definitely is. But how do we deal with those perceived risks? How do we deal in the case of Helen Haynes, the solar farm in her electorate? People concerned about fire. What is the best strategy to bring the community along? Because basic facts aren't necessarily going to impact, are they?
Well, they're not when we may not have an agreement on what the basic fact is, and that goes to our earlier conversation, right? So we're really not on the same page. So number one, and there are experts who are far better at this than I am, but I work with them on a daily basis, and the things that I'm learning from them are the importance of sensitivity to communities, the importance of, and I'll say it again, place-based approaches. And what that means is meeting people in their community to really understand, what are they experiencing? What are they hoping for? What are they worried about? I've written about it before and others have said it, but people live in places, not projects. And our regulation, the way that we go about infrastructure development, is on a project by project basis. And that does not reflect communities' reality. So step one is to meet communities where they are at, to really understand their perspectives and their concerns. And then having that understanding, work through, okay, how could this renewable energy project that we need to deliver, what would be the most sensitive, best way to institute this project in this community? This isn't about rolling out cookie cutter approaches. Organizations like the Energy Charter, which is a group of private sector energy companies that are coming together in a collective to try and improve their capacity to address community concerns and to do engagement well. So they are making an effort. They have recently rolled out what's called the Regional Collaboration Framework. So this is a pilot. They started in the Wimmera Mallee here in Victoria, and they are trying to get renewable energy companies to work together in a place-based way and to really understand not only what community members are concerned about in terms of their individual project, but what they're concerned about in relation to the cumulative impacts of all the different projects that are going on. So That's something worth looking up too. It's called the Regional Collaboration Framework from the Energy Charter, and it's still in the process of being refined. I think it's a really important step, though, that's being taken to address some of these issues.
Look, I take your point about needing greater sensitivity when it comes to dealing with communities, different communities. And as you say, they're all different. They all need different things. And individuals within those communities need different things. But just to play the cynic, maybe,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
maybe be a bit Trumpian about this, don't communities just need a better deal from the renewable energy industry?
This one comes up time and again, and look, there's no right answer, right? Because as you just said, every community is different, and there might be some communities that are quite happy to make a deal. And that's just how they roll. And we saw that if we look back, for instance, a totally different sector or moving in a different direction than towards climate adaptation, but the coal seam gas sector, when the coal seam gas sector was really heating up in Australia, we saw very, very different approaches. There were communities in Queensland and the Northern Territory in particular that were saying, bring it on. We want the economic development. Let's make a deal. Whereas in Victoria, we saw, the government put a full scale stop on any, not just development, but
Isn't
exploration.
that partly because of what they saw happen in Queensland?
Yeah, like it could be. It could be. And I'm not speaking coal seam gas here today, but the point is more that um, different communities will have different expectations and different priorities. And there may be some communities for whom making a deal is the way that they want to go. What we can say, though, across the board is that attempts to, in most instances, when we talk about making a deal, we're talking about payments. Most attempts to create payment or incentive or recognition structures within the renewable sector, and this is not just in Australia, it's internationally. Um, if they haven't failed, they've really struggled. Because, for instance, and people know this, when you put up a wind turbine, usually the way these structures work is that the individual on whose land the turbine is based will receive a particular amount, and then the individuals within, say, 2 kilometers of the turbine might receive a particular but lesser amount, and then the individuals who are outside of that wider circle receive a thanks very much, have a nice life. And they're really unhappy about that. So, it can create then um, conflict within communities.
It really
It
has split them,
it
yeah.
it has, and so it's not a particularly effective way to go about things. And there's a really challenging balance here because I personally believe on the one hand that people should be recompensed for supporting our collective need for an energy transition. So they should receive some form of appropriate compensation. But if we make the transition or our way to the transition only about trying to design deals or compensation agreements, we're never going to get there.
But it comes back to the point that you made. What's different about Australia's energy transition is that it's largely being driven by private industry, and private industry. If you get your project up, you potentially can make a lot of money, and communities are seeing that. So it kind of maybe supports that point about communities wanting a better deal.
Yeah, and I think communities see that too, and I think communities are very savvy, and they know that, if these folks don't get their projects up, they're not gonna make their money, so therefore, they're going to have to, at some stage, work effectively with local communities. I think the danger there is that if the negotiations between communities and these private sector companies veer too much into the capitalist monetary space, the communities risk a big loss, and that loss might be in their own identity, in their levels of social cohesion within the community, which is how interconnected people feel with one another as a community. They may start to lose their own identity as a community. There are researchers in environmental philosophy who have coined terms to explain these losses. There's something called solastalgia, which is when you're in your home, the place where you've grown up and probably where you've had your farm, and you feel a sense of nostalgic homesickness for how the place used to be, and it's never going to come back. There's, it's a horrible feeling. We don't want Australian communities to get to a point because of the renewables transition where, they're homesick for a place that's never coming back. So, yes, we need to have appropriate compensation. Yes, these private sector companies stand to gain quite a lot from being able to institute their projects in Australian regional and rural communities. But also, there are potentially very big losses if we do this in an insensitive way that destroys social cohesion and that potentially destroys the identity of these communities.
Yes, very interesting. Sarah, just one last question. Just tell me what gives you optimism, if anything, that the energy transition can still be fast but fair.
Yeah, look, I have a lot of optimism here because there are so many good groups in Australia that are trying to do the right thing, including the communities who will host the energy infrastructure. I do think at the end of the day, we all recognize, or most of us recognize, that we've got to get this done. And Australians are really good at getting things done. I have a lot of optimism in that we do, across the board in Australia, on all types of infrastructure, have very high quality engagement generally. So we need to raise the bar in the renewable sector, but we do tend to have very high quality engagement. We do, despite today's conversation, and we focus a lot on critique, but we do have very good policies and regulations, particularly to protect against environmental and social impacts. So the the baseline is there. We do have a lot of the settings right. What we need now is to determine how can we shift our usual project by project approach to a more place-based approach. Our team has been working on frameworks and tools to support governments to do this, including undertaking social due diligence so that they can really understand local communities. There is a lot to be optimistic about as well. Like Australia right now, even though we don't have the transmission capacity to utilize all of the renewable energy that we're generating, we now have in the existing renewable energy infrastructure across Australia, including residential solar, we have more generating capacity from renewables than from fossil fuels. We're doing well. We're too slow and we're probably not going to hit all of our targets, and that's okay. Well, it's not really okay, but we'll have to say it's okay because we're Australian and we just kind of get on with things. She'll be right. But yeah, we are making gains, and I think we can continue to make gains. I would just like to see us do that in a way that is far more amenable and sensitive to our communities, and I suppose far more gracious towards those communities who are making a clean energy transition possible for the rest of us.
Sara Bice, thank you so much for joining the Switched On podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Anna. It's been a pleasure.
And Sara Bice is Professor at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University, where she directs the Institute for Infrastructure in Society. And just a reminder, some of the resources Sara mentioned were the Disinformation in the City Response Playbook, which deals with misinformation and distrust in communities. And there's also the Energy Charter's Regional Energy Collaboration Framework, that's a mouthful, which provides a place-based approach to collaboration and benefit sharing. Until next time, I'm Anne Delaney, and this has been Switched On Australia.